Luke chapter 2 in 5 minutes. If you want this free handout, you can get it off our website, link down below. The first question is, when do these events take place? The first part of the chapter takes place when Jesus is born, right around 1 AD. The second part of the chapter takes place when Jesus is 12 years old, so that makes it about 12 AD. Who are the main characters in this chapter? Well, we've already been introduced to some of them back in chapter 1, Mary and Joseph. Now we're going to be introduced finally to their baby son, Jesus. His birth was foretold in chapter 1. The beginning of chapter 2, he finally arrives. There's also some shepherds. They are shepherds around the town of Bethlehem, and they come to see the baby Messiah. And then there's two people that are mentioned only in Luke's gospel and only in this chapter, Simeon and Anna. Both were righteous before God, and God had promised Simeon that he would get to see the Messiah before he died. And Anna was a prophetess who spent her time in the temple praying and fasting. Where do the events of chapter 2 take place? I've already mentioned a couple of these towns, but the chapter opens in Bethlehem. Then there's a brief mention in Nazareth, which is Mary and Joseph's hometown, and then the majority of the events happen in Jerusalem. Let's go over our overview now and hit the highlights. Verses 1 through 7 is all about Jesus' birth. Caesar Augustus was an emperor of Rome at the time, and he decreed that everyone was supposed to be registered, probably for tax purposes, kind of like a census, I suppose. Mary and Joseph, who lived in Nazareth, they went to Joseph's hometown, which was Bethlehem, for this registration. Mary was really pregnant at this point, and she was ready to give birth. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, her time came, and she gave birth to a son. And there was no room in the inn at the time, probably because everyone was traveling for this registration. So she laid her son in a manger. The next section of the chapter, verses 8 through 21, talks about the visit of the shepherds. So there were some shepherds shepherding their sheep around Bethlehem during this time, and an angel appeared to them and told them that a child had been born. And this child wasn't just any child, this was the Savior. This was Christ the Lord. The shepherds were told that they could find Jesus in a manger wrapped in swaddling clothes. But before the angel left, the shepherds looked up in the sky and they saw what's called a multitude of the heavenly hosts, angels and heavenly beings, and they were praising God for everything that he was doing on the earth. The shepherds then left and they found Jesus, and they told Mary and Joseph and the people who had gathered all of the things that they had seen. The next section is verses 22 through 38. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, they all take a trip to Jerusalem because there's some commands in the Old Testament law regarding childbirth that Mary and Joseph are responsible for keeping. And this occurs about a month after Jesus is born. They took an offering of 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And you can read about this Old Testament law in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. There in Jerusalem, they meet a man named Simeon. Simeon said to be a righteous man. He was a God-fearing man. And he had been promised by God that he wouldn't die until he got to see the Savior. So he runs in to Mary and Joseph, and he sees Jesus, and he takes Jesus up in his arms, and he begins worshiping God for allowing him to see his salvation. Following this, in the temple, Mary and Joseph meet a woman named Anna. She's a very old woman, she's a widow, and she's a prophetess who spends all of her time in the temple praying and fasting. And she knows who Jesus is, and she praises God for him, and she starts telling everybody who will listen to her about who he is. The last section of the chapter, verses 41 through 52, Jesus' parents lose him in Jerusalem. And these events occur 12 years after meeting Anna and Simeon in the temple. So keep that in mind. This is now 12 years later. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Jesus' parents and him had gone down to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast. On their way back, Jesus' parents assumed that he was with their relatives also traveling back to Nazareth, but he wasn't. They figured this out after they had gone a day's journey. Then they had to go back to Jerusalem, and they looked for Jesus for 3 days. And they finally found him in the temple talking to the religious teachers. And when his parents asked him about it, why did you do this to us? Why didn't you come with us back home? He responds to them and he says, "Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house?" And then the chapter closes with Jesus going with his parents, finally, back home to Nazareth. Let's talk about the big picture now. How does chapter 2 fit into the big picture? Well, this is a really important chapter because Jesus is born. So Jesus creates the world all the way back in the beginning, and for years and years and years, he watches people struggle with sin and try to solve the sin problem, and they can't do it. And so now the Creator has stepped onto the world that He created in order to be the solution to and the salvation from sin. Now let's talk about takeaways or application. Just one application from chapter 2, and it's this. God is often working in huge ways through subtle means. Think about it. When Jesus' family went to Jerusalem, the only people that recognized him were Simeon and Anna. Not really people of significance. They didn't have a parade for him. It's not like everybody recognized him. And this is pretty much the way that it went throughout Jesus' first 30 years. Most people didn't know that the Savior of the world, God on earth, was being raised in the town of Nazareth. So God was very subtle about this. And nobody knew that earth-altering events, world-shaping events were about to occur until Jesus actually stepped out and said, "This is who I am." And I think that's important because it means that God can be doing big things in our lives even when we don't see them. Even when I feel like God isn't working, like my prayers aren't getting answered, it may be the case that He's doing huge things under the surface.